So just taking a look at the overall form here, trying to decide what type of a mouth we're going to give this character. How big of a bulge do we want here, where that muscle is starting to overlap again. And now you can really start to see where that form is kind of compressing as those lips hit the corner there and fold back on themselves. And I think what I'd like to do here is go ahead and put a first character pass on most of these forms as well. So we're just going to come back up to the eyes now that we kind of have the new mouth and jaw in place. I'm going to go ahead and come up here and take a look at the eyes and see what kind of a character we want to develop through the eyes as well, and then we'll move on to the nose. But again, then this won't be the final pass. We'll probably come back one more time to really define everything and kind of give it a cleanup pass. And right now I'm just taking a look at that upper orbital portion of the eye, this area here where we looked at that transitional plane that we created earlier in the lecture, and just seeing how much of that plane I want to come down and overlap the upper eyelid. Quickly move on to the nose as well. And really what I'm doing here is just filling in all the gaps, just really trying to get more of a global sense of how all these features are fitting together. You can also see how I've added some of the zygomatic muscles, the major and minor, so those muscles that are stretching between the cheekbone down to the face. I just went ahead and added one solid mass in there, and we will be going back in briefly towards the end of the lecture and separating a few of those muscles out and just taking a quick look at them. And again, for me it was really important just to realize that by setting up the skull in the proper way, that allowed me to have the space necessary to lay those muscles in there so they actually do stretch from that lower part of the cheekbone out towards the mouth. But as long as I have the skull proportions correct, then laying those muscles in there is kind of a secondary thought, because they really do just stretch from one point to the other. So real simple origin and insertion. Just going in here and starting to add a few superficial details to the eye, but I want to hold off on that until that final pass and really make sure everything's working well together. Alright, let's move on to the ear and see if we can solidify some of these forms. Really start to differentiate between that outer and inner helix. Again, the outer helix is that C shape that almost comes back in towards the front here and wraps in on itself. But if you set that C shape up correctly, then it's pretty easy to integrate the inner helix, that Y shape, that almost blends right into the outer helix at the bottom here towards the lobe. So those two merge together and create the lobe. And then as that inner helix comes up to the top there, you can see it makes a Y shape essentially. Move to the back of the ear and back to the front. Always looking at all these different angles again, because the ear is more or less protruding out from the body. It's easy to make the faces accidentally collapse on one another, so I always want to take a look at the back side as well. And it's always a good point for me, at least, to develop the entire form all at once and make sure I don't just focus on one area for too long. Again, making these global changes, stepping back down to a lower level, and pull that ear hole in, and then I can check the location of my ear as well. Notice how the whole ear from side view is angling back. Obviously that can change, but it's more often than not the entire ear, and it has a backward angle to it. Now I've moved on to the clay tubes brush just to help take out some of those high points and low points in the surface. For me, the clay tube brush works a lot better when I'm on higher levels, because it does tend to kind of unify the surface. So it's a nice tool to take more of a finished pass over the entire form. Let's see how now we're really defining that inner helix, and you can see that Y shape pretty well from this angle. And sometimes the tips, or I guess the upper arms of the Y, actually extend in past or up underneath this outer helix. So that really depends on the individual person's ear. Come back here and hit a combination of the smooth brush and the clay brush just to kind of clean up these forms and make the surfaces a little bit truer. back to the pinch brush as well as using the smooth brush in between. But the shape of the inner and outer helix can vary greatly, so it's always worth taking a closer look at those on the specific character you're trying to create. Just zoom out here and take a little bit of a broader look at the overall scale and position of the ear. And I think we're in pretty good shape with those, so let's go ahead and take a second to make sure that all the facial features that we've created so far are in scale and working well with the muscles of the body that we created in part 1. And I think we're in pretty good shape. I think the character's face is reading well enough for the type of person we're trying to create here. So let's go ahead and move on to finishing up the mouth. And in this section we will be talking a little bit more about some of the specific muscles in this area, but more importantly I'm going to be trying to talk about how they overlap and the type of forms that they create as they intersect and overlap and kind of come together. And really some of the muscles of the body are a little bit simpler in that you have an origin and insertion point and then essentially the form that spans between them, but because there's so much animation and movement that goes on in the face for such a small area, there are a lot of muscles that overlap and really become complex. So in some ways it's really more about reading the form than it is just understanding the origin and insertion points. So here you can see I'm kind of starting to just sketch out these individual muscles and some of the important ones, and we talked earlier a little bit about the muscles that are wrapping around the mouth, but then how this muscle here, so the depressor here, kind of wraps up and around on top of the mouth there, and that's what starts to give you that bulge on the side towards the corner of the mouth. So obviously that varies depending on the character and type of character you're working on, but you can see how that's really wrapping around and intersecting and becoming a part of that muscle that's on the top upper area of the lip, just kind of blending right into the side there, and then it can wrap all the way down into the side and actually connect closer to the chin. Go ahead and turn on transparency and just see where our mouth opening is relative to the teeth. So our guy is kind of pushing his lip up a little bit, kind of giving a stern look, and his lower lip is protruding out a little bit more. So hopefully that reads the way we want it to with our character. I think that's kind of more or less what I'm going for, a little bit of a stronger chin there with a little bit of a stern look. So in my interpretation I just translated that into pushing the bottom lip out a little bit further. And again, that actually went all the way back to taking the jaw from the bone and then pulling that out and then moving the muscles to match and layer on top of that. So really it's just following all the way through from the bone to the muscle, now to the fatty tissues and everything else that makes up that shape in the lip. You can see coming back in with the pinch brush again to really start to define some of those details and those sharp edges. And this is another good angle to take a look at how all these surfaces are coming together here in that corner. If we think back to the beginning of the lecture when we created that transitional plane, that represents the lips, so that rubber band type of plane that's wrapping back around on itself, and you can see in there in the corner it's disappearing right underneath this muscle here, the depressor anguli oris. And you can see how that's now really starting to create that bulge, but if when you look at all these muscles as they're overlapping and layering, it can get really confusing, really difficult to understand. So again, the one thing that helped me the most was just trying to go back and find the most fundamental shape, the simplest transitional plane for those lips, to really start to set things up and then try to understand how these other things layer in on top of it. Just also starting to put some of the muscle striations in there to kind of indicate the direction of the muscle. So you can see around the bottom of the lip the direction of that muscle wrapping around that orbicularis oris, that same muscle that wrapped around from the top. Just kind of coming into the depressor again and really starting to make sure that form reads true in the striation and the direction of those muscles. See how they're pulling and wrapping around there. A lot of times at the back side of that muscle on some men you can have a crease that shows up in the skin. Back there, kind of that lower smile line crease. Can wrap all the way down there around the chin. Just hitting some of these muscles here, some of the depressor muscles, the mentalis muscle on the chin. So really just filling those forms in. So there's some interesting transitions there as these muscles blend together and overlap. You can see, now you can really see that bulge there in the indication from that muscle. And of course, as the mouth opens, that bulge tends to go away because the actual bulge is from the muscle compressing and being bunched together there. But obviously, as it opens up and becomes more of an oval shape, then that's going to stretch out, particularly at that point right near the corner, in each corner of the mouth, and kind of thin out and make that bump less noticeable. Alright, I think that about does it for the mouth. Let's go ahead and transition onto the nose. Start by defining those two parts of the alar cartilage there at the tip of the nose, and give some more definition to the inside of the nostril there. And again, I just like to set up these individual pieces, coming up there to the bridge in the nose from the nasal bone right down to the triangular cartilage, the top of the bone that transitions into the end there. Just set up all these pieces and planes and then kind of work them together and really understand, how the subtle transitions between them are going to take place. Coming in there with the nasilar muscle, a really subtle muscle that's going to wrap up and around the outside of the nostril. Back up to that triangular cartilage, which more or less begins at the end of the nasal bone. There's a little bit of overlap there, a little bit of transition. Subdivide again and then switch to the clay tubes, just to start to give a little bit more of a clearer definition to some of these shapes. Really work out that cartilage there. In some people you can really see the difference down the center line of the nose there on that cartilage towards the tip of the nose. It's really noticeable. But on others, it's a completely different shape. So again, this is, for me, it's just a good place to start. You can see here the nostril kind of wrapping up and around and flowing right back up into the nose. But again, a good place to start, and then kind of vary the individual's nose from here. Working again in this triangular cartilage area. So a lot of complex shapes there, a lot of transitions. Global changes, step back down. But really, just by trying to define some of these things, if I look at that cartilage at the tip of the nose and then the nostril as that broad U shape, if I really just put those together in the simplest way, then it's much easier for me to kind of use the transitions between those shapes as a way to fill in the blanks. Looking at more of this musculature here, the way it's wrapping and kind of coming right up onto the cartilage of the nose. So all that cartilage and the nasal bone is what's making up the bridge of the nose. So really, we're looking at a lot of different things, a lot of complex shapes kind of coming together to create that form. Put a few striations in there. And take one last look down here at the bottom of the nose and see how that inner part of the nostril is transitioning out. And I think that's looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and move on to the eyes. And let's go ahead and turn on transparency. Just take a look at the location of our eyeball, so the sphere that we have representing our eyeball. See where it's located within that eye socket. And obviously, as that varies, you get a very different type of eye shape. An eye can sit further in, so be sunken into that eye socket, or it can really protrude out. Typically, the further it protrudes out, the less mass you have over the eye in that orbital portion of the eye that we talked about with our transitional plane earlier, right up here. Again, the further out the eyeball is, then the less mass that you typically have hanging over it. And really that just gives a different type of read for your character. So I think we're okay with the placement of our sphere right now, because I do want a little bit of a mass up there and I give him a bit of a furrow to the brow. A lot of the muscles that comprise the eye here, just wrap around in a circular fashion and encompass the eye. So there's not too much individual definition or origin and insertion of those muscles because they're essentially continuous as they wrap around. So it really does start to depend more on the form that that muscle is taking. So as it's contracting, in a different area right now, it's kind of pulling in and down towards the inner corner of the eye to give him a little bit of a furrow. It's really about the massing of that muscle that's going to give us the best read of the character's personality. Go in here again with the clay tubes brush, a really nice brush to just take all those imperfections of the surface out. Gets rid of the highs and the lows simultaneously, which is really nice. Come in there and give a little bit more form to the eyelid. Here you can really see how that upper portion of the eye there, that orbital portion, is kind of compressing right down on top of the upper eyelid. So in this case ours is just above the upper eyelid, but again, depending on your character, that can actually overlap and hang down. A lot of times as people get older, that part can completely cover the upper eyelid. So just something to be aware of. And obviously, if it is in a different position, it might give a different read to your character. So just helps to maybe have a little bit of an idea in advance as you're developing those forms there, kind of see where you want that to go. Just going to pull the nose subtool part out, fill in that muscle gap there. Those are our different muscles that basically span from that cheekbone area right down to the center part of the nose. Just fill in those little spaces, give a few more striations in there. Then we'll jump back to the eye. Looking at that lower, there's a little bit of a bulge underneath the lower eyelid. You can see it here from this view as well. That secondary hit underneath the lower eyelid. And that's the lower orbital portion of the eye. So it's really the difference between the bottom eyelid and the cheekbone. So you typically have a gap between those two, and then it can be filled by that secondary form. Sometimes it bumps out, sometimes it's depressed in. It's really depends on your character, but what's helped me define that is really just understanding where that bottom eyelid's going to stop, and then where the cheekbone begins. And it's up to you to just fill in the space between. And I'll just take a second to true up the upper eyelid here. Use a combination of the move tool and the smooth tool. So kind of moving and then smoothing, and moving at the high points in and the low points out. And come down to the outside of the eye and do a little bit of the same there as well. But move down to these lower levels when I have to make the global changes. Maybe put a little bit more mass in that upper eyelid and take a little bit out of the lower eyelid just to make them a little more equal. And it's always easier for me to change the shape of that eyelid on a lower level. So it really just, for me, just gives me a lot more trouble than it's worth when I do it on a higher level there. Zoom out and take a look at the overall shapes, the forms, and kind of look at, there's that secondary mass again we talked about, that lower orbital part of the eye. And maybe want that a little bit fuller. Make sure the brow is coming in and down around the way I was hoping. Let's true up those forms again on the top part. And it's always beneficial for me to every once in a while just take a step back and get more of a global view of the eye and what's going on. It's really easy to fall into a trap if you're too close and you're working on all those little specific areas or little muscle striations. It's easy to lose the overall shape or overlook something. So throughout the process, I'm always trying to step back and take more of a global look at what's going on and look at the proportions, the overall proportions of these individual forms or shapes as they come together and intersect and overlap. Start to throw in some muscle striations here. Again, just to help define the direction of the muscle. You see how it's wrapping around the eye, creating the eyelid, and then just kind of continues to spiral out from there, and continuing all the way onto the inside portion of the eye. So on the inside there, it's almost cradling the lower eyelid. Sometimes it can actually be a little bit more pronounced and come out in front of the lower eyelid as well. Let's go ahead and move on. You can see I just threw in this muscle up here, the frontalis muscle. Pretty straightforward again, as this raises and kind of compresses, you get some wrinkling on the skin there, but pretty straightforward. Again, similar to the the temporalis muscle that we talked about, just very straightforward form development, and depending on how much mass you have there, sometimes you get a little bit of a bulge from that over the brow area. So that's why I threw it in here, just so we could take a look at that. It can give a little bit of a hit or a surface change right there. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward for its origin and insertion. The other difficult thing about the face muscles is a lot of them interlace. So there's interlacing that goes on between the eye muscles and then the temporalis muscles, and particularly in the mouth area. So it doesn't make it easy. Let's go ahead and move on to some of these muscles right in here. Again, these are pretty straightforward. The way they wrap around, you have a few different muscles here, the zygomatus and the buccinator and the risorius, all these different muscles just spanning that gap. Again, that was the easiest way I was able to kind of try to understand that form, is just really seeing how they wrap around and go from one point to the other. So if these are one of those muscles that it does help to know the origin and insertions. Just understand that they start from this cheekbone area here on the lower side, and then come in and basically interlace into some of those mouth muscles, kind of wrap right around into that form. But again, you can see here, if these flex along their length, then that's why you start to get some creases in there around the smile lines and other things. If you kind of make a snarl, that will also give a crease there as it wraps up and around your nose. It's just compressing that skin that is along the length of this muscle. So you can see how they also do a lot of overlapping, and but rarely do they define the form. Rarely do you see differentiations in between those muscles, along their length that runs from the cheekbone down to the mouth. Let's go ahead and take a last look here and bring back some of the muscles from part 1 of the form of anatomy, so sternocleidomastoid, mastoid, and trapezius, just to make sure that the proportions of the head and the face are working well with the rest of the body. And that about does it for part 2 of the form of anatomy, the skull and the muscles of the face. I hope you've enjoyed, and thanks for listening.